and welcome to the last plenary session of this year's International Youth Conference in Krushevo. I hope you had a nice lunch. I hope you're all relaxed and ready for this session. And I'm very happy to be able to announce our participants. First of all, the name of this session is Leaping into the Shared EU Horizon, Western Balkans 6, Southeastern Europe region, and EU, what lies ahead. Preparing this conference, we were talking about the whole idea of how it should be set up. And the idea we mostly had was to promote it as 3 days that are separated by time period. So for the first day, we were mostly talking about past. For the second day, we were talking mostly about the present. And today, we'll be mostly, once again, talking about the future. That's why we have a very interesting topic. And as you will hear, our panelists will be talking about a lot of important things and what lies ahead for the European Union, for the Western Balkans 6, and rest of the Balkans as well. So, first of all, I am very happy to present Ms. Simonida Kaczarska. She is the director of the European Policy Institute in Skopje, and she has a PhD in politics and international studies. And today she's going to be talking with us through Zoom platform. So, Ms. Simonida, welcome. After that, we have Mr. Emir Hasanovic, and he's a Western Balkan coordinator at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and also a graduate at the Georgetown School of Foreign Studies. Foreign Service, I'm so sorry. And last but not least, we have Mr. Christian Fidanovsky, the doctoral researcher at University of Oxford and committed to research and teaching, and also very interesting to me, a film critic by night. It's very interesting to say that we have a connection through Mr. Christian, because while Mr. Emir and Mr. Christian have been together, not at the same time, but they have a connection through Georgetown University. Ms. Simonida and Mr. Christian have another connection through Oxford University. So you will be today like one of the connections with everything we'll be talking about and the other panelists. Welcome, and first of all, I'm going to give the floor and the Zoom audio to Ms. Simonida Kaczarska. Welcome, and you have your 15 minutes.
Thank you, Marco, and hello to everyone from Skopje. It's a pleasure to be speaking at the conference, which is now a tradition in Krushevo. I would have loved to be there, and I was planning to be there, but somehow I'm not probably anymore in the absolute youth bracket. So kind of my back started hurting and my eye got some infection, so it turned out that I could not make it. But given that Anelia was very strict at the beginning, I just wanted to say that I'm really hoping that you will get to walk around the hills of Krushevo, or you have already, because the autumnal colors are some of the prettiest that that I have ever seen probably in my life. I have 15 minutes. I will try to be shorter than 15 so that we have some time for discussion possibly, or questions. And thanks to the organizer for giving me the opportunity to speak in this panel about the future. One of the reasons that I did want to come to Krushevo and spend some time with you was actually that probably most of my university years were spent at conferences such as the ones you're attending now, in a different context. So, if I take a look back, I studied at university in the early 2000s. And most of my conferences and summer schools were actually devoted to discussing the conflicts in the former Yugoslav space, and building bridges between the countries and the youth of the region. As a result, probably one of the most of the key people in my life today are actually from the former Yugoslav space somehow. So I really hope that a lot of the links that will be made at this conference will have a lasting impact on many of you there. So if we are leaping into the future, as I was asked to reflect, I am one of the expectations probably of most of us, having worked on these topics of the EU integration, is also to build these bridges which were rather missing with some of our neighbors, especially the EU member states. And in this case, I think the effort of the Youth Center from Krushevo and generally the work that they are doing in this respect is commendable. And hopefully their leap into the future will have effects in a shorter period than mine. But I can for sure be confident that in a decade, the situation in terms of the people-to-people exchange and the youth exchange will be much different than what we were used to see in this context. Now, this has reminiscences over the entire process of how do we build our common future in the European Union, because it's clear that, and I think you've heard it over these two days when I saw on the agenda. You've had some of the positive examples, but largely we must not forget that there is a growing frustration in the region with the speed of the enlargement process, with the speed of the reforms. And this frustration has been both with the national institutions, with the state of democracy at home, but also with some of the trends and some of the priorities of the European Union itself. This year has been historic and has been very tumultuous in many ways. And probably, I'm sure that actually in light of what lies ahead, we have a different context than what was the case last year, probably, and in previous years, because we do have a war and aggression in Europe, and this was not the case before. And I think for many of us or for many of you that have been brought up in a Europe that has not seen war for a long time, this is a new geopolitical situation. And I think that unfortunately it might take this invasion or this war to actually be able to reflect better as to the what is our common and shared future, because I think that in a lot of the EU decision-making bodies and a lot of the centers of the European Union, at least at the political level, the aggression of Ukraine has raised the flag and has kind of brought us back also into the spotlight. The bigger question that we have, let's say, and I belong to some expert circle that discusses these matters for the last 2 decades, is actually whether on the EU side there will be enough will to engage with this region as potential new member states. And I think that this was largely the political message that was sent over these days, but this needs to be followed up with some actual steps of the EU institutions, and we are probably yet to see how this will unravel. At the same time, also the big question, and probably for many of you, are those numbers of 60 to 70%, or how many there are, of the standard response of the youth. Do you plan to leave the country in the next 5 years or after you graduate? The numbers in this region are staggeringly high. And the big question that many of us do have is actually how much of the critical mass or the educated youth will be in the countries to contribute or to devote to some of these very difficult transformations that need to be undertaken. I'm not a fan, and I think all of us have become, that no one can be kept by force somewhere, and they shouldn't be. We are hoping that we can actually benefit from some of these circular movements in the long term. But in order to, at least for some people to stay, there needs to be a more conducive environment to self-development, which we are hoping that the EU will also support in the long term itself. I think I will actually end here. for these introductory remarks. If I have to leap into the future and look for some desired scenario, it would be definitely one in which the after 10 years events such as this one would create much more people-to-people exchange and much more understanding of the fact that in the future, like in whatever format we would be in the European Union, the region, or at least the Southeastern Europe, and the broader context will be one region in the context of the European Union. Coming from someone who has been brought up for probably the 40 years of her life with disputes with the neighbors, I think we've kind of realized that we cannot geographically dislocate ourselves. We have to be able to find ways in which we will cooperate and to discuss matters, no matter how much we like or dislike the topics at the table itself. Thank you, Marco. And then I'm open for discussion and questions.
First of all, thank you. And it's very interesting that actually, even though you weren't able to be here with us for these past few days, you mentioned almost all or a lot of important topics we were discussing these past few days, and that we as youth actually see as big problems, opportunities, and I don't know, ideas for the future of this region and Europe as a whole. So thank you for that. And now I'm giving the floor to Mr. Emir Hasanovic. And also, I would like to ask you kindly to, because I really like the idea of the question, where do you see the leap going? How do you see the leap? So if you can end also with your idea. So let's be a little bit imaginary at the end of your speech. Thank you.
I will definitely try. So first and foremost, I want to thank Youth Alliance for continuing this amazing tradition and congratulating them on 20 years of successful youth conference organizations, and of course maintaining the enthusiasm and the outstanding support for the past few days for everyone. And just a great shout out to Toshe, to Biljana, to Anelia, and to all the supporting staff. Bravo, really great platform for youth, and you demonstrate that you really should take them really seriously. So hands for them, guys. They've really done it. And it's always a little bit of an ungrateful position to be at the graveyard panel, the last panel at the conference. But kudos to you also for still being concentrated, following, and being able to ask questions. And we definitely have a tough act to follow after the panel we just had before with Nick Squared and their role in the PRESPA agreement. But I think we're discussing a very important question as a summary of everything that you've done. I've heard some really amazing stuff, and it's really gotten me to think about what it is that we're supposed to do on the third day, which is the future. And I think that the term leap into sort of the horizon is the right terminology, because we don't really have a choice but to leap into what is coming, because we have a very complex context we're operating in. Some of those things, and again, the Balkan Peninsula is just a peninsula and not an island, so we're not immune to what is happening in the world and all these things that we're facing. And as a generation, some of our challenges are, you know, the impending doom of climate neglect. I don't think it's climate change or anything, it's climate neglect. It's institutional, generational neglect of what is climate and what is the environmental impact that humans have. We have the global shift in polarity. We no longer live in a unipolar world, de facto unipolar world that we inherited. We have an open conflict on European soil after a few decades of relative peace. We have economic destitute. Some of the things that our parents were able to dream of and afford for us, starting from housing and other things, are becoming relatively difficult to imagine how we can achieve. Rising inflation. And guys, we survived the pandemic, so kudos to that as well. We were able to be in Krushevo and be in person. Sadly, Simonika couldn't join us, but for other reasons. But that is also something that we endured and that we've done. We've also, and I think these two are the symptoms of what the issues are, rise of right-wing nationalism across the continent and the world at large. and foreign influence. Now, I will be referring to my notes quite a bit because I have 2 PhDs next to me. I have to stick to a format and facts, and my good friend here always calls me out, so I'll make sure to do that. But honestly, I'm not surprised by this situation. I think that might be a product of my education because I was educated at Georgetown, but in the Middle East. And while I was there, we were talking about water rivalries. So those regions were already talking about the deficiencies of water in different regions and the impact that it has. We were talking about the awakening of the dragon, or China reasserting itself on the global political stage. And what I think we are witnessing is the end of Pax Americana, which is the sort of comparison with the Pax Romana and Pax Britannica, or the guaranteed peace by these large forces who were able to maintain stability. And I mentioned the Pax Americana because the European Union is inextricably linked with that. The Marshall Plan, which was supposed to bring peace to Europe, was basically also very, very closely linked with the European community and European Union, which is an economic union in many ways, but was a political project to create those interconnections between countries. And when you think about that, the Western Hemisphere has endured relative peace with, of course, some episodes, but it also, the European Union played a role in that. So Central Europe, for instance, and the integration of Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall were successful projects of integrating countries with different political heritage into this community of nations with shared values and principles. And I think the Balkans is a part of that story as well. Although our efforts seem relatively Sisyphonian, and believe me, as somebody from North Macedonia, I'm very aware of that. As soon as we come to one hurdle, the Ohrid Framework Agreement, another one comes in, the name issue. We do the name issue, the French rejection. After the French rejection, we have the Bulgarian issue. We're constantly on this path, and it's no different for the other Balkan countries. Serbia faces those issues. Bosnia and Herzegovina, God knows they do. Kosovo as well, Montenegro, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, our generation, and this is sort of the outlook on the horizon that I have, although I am 29, I'm slowly exiting the youth bracket. But our generation does not have the luxury to prioritize. So we don't have the luxury to look at things such as, let's deal with economics, let's deal with bilateral issues, let's deal with this, and so on and so forth, in a manner that is sequential. We have to do a lot of things at the same time. We have to deal with the pandemic, we have to deal with the rising inflation, we have to deal with security issues, bilateral issues, deal with historical matters, and so on and so forth. And that is not easy, but we need to step up. And I think when you look at Europe and the people who were able to guarantee peace and prosperity on the continent were the people who actually witnessed the terror of what came before, which was the World War, which initially inspired the thinking behind the European project. And again, out of respect to my PhD colleagues, I will not say that there is a causality there, but just a correlation that those people are no longer either retired or no longer on the political stage. So we have people who are in that inherited system but haven't managed to find an amalgamation that works in the contemporary context, that works in a Russia that is post-Soviet and that is asserting itself on the political stage, that works with a rising China, that works with a rising India, that works with African nations who are developing at a very rapid pace. So we have a very different political context. But we still have to maintain that enthusiasm. And I think we are the generation of the World War II that will build things, that will build a new order that will accommodate all these new circumstances. And that's not an easy task. I don't know at what cost we will be able to do that, but we will. But it's up to us to be able to gauge these challenges in a manner that is different from that generation, which was, you know, the boomer generation of the 60s that inherited an already stable political system relatively, and a relatively stable global order, and we need to assess things and we need to be a little bit more proactive. We don't have a lot of luxury for improvisation. But in terms of the EU and the Western Balkans and Southeast Europe, I will try to keep to that. Please interrupt me if I go over time. I don't think European Union membership is the solution. And I know this is a little bit of a head-tilting statement, but it isn't. If we look at certain members, if you look at, for example, Bulgaria and Croatia, membership in and of itself did not bring solutions. What brought about solutions is the transformative power of the process. For countries that adhered and stuck to that process, there were results. Ivo Sanader happened after, I think, the membership of Croatia. And that was a huge scandal. Bulgaria faced a lot of similar scandals after membership. So we need to look at things a little bit more succinctly into the challenges that we have. We need to use the process of membership in order to transform. And I'm not particularly worried anymore about the methodology employed and so on and so forth. I don't want to talk about form. I want to talk about reforms that make sense into the current context. And that is the gravitational pull of the EU. So when you're in, we talk about, for example, Hungary and other countries that have issues which are in some kind of conflict with European values. But we have a gravitational center, the values. And we know how far you oscillate from those values, and the union can change with you, and the union can transform the society from within. So that is the power, the real power, according to me, of the European Union. So how do we go about that? We can't do it alone, especially in the Balkans. Every nation has its own sort of mythology, and we use those mythologies, unfortunately, to negative ends. I think we need to talk about ways in which we can do with which we can expedite the process. And there are a lot of regional initiatives for cooperation. And I want to address the elephant in the room, which always comes up in questions. And I will talk about different modes of operandi when it comes to regional cooperation. Open Balkans is one of them. But we also have a lot of other things that come in the package of regional cooperation. Every time there is something that stems from a region, in my humble view, is heralded as success, because we produce more nationalism than we can consume, and whenever we produce something productive such as Open Balkans, everybody sort of sees it with positive eyes. But let's talk about that. Open Balkans unfortunately has the buy-in from 3 countries so far, and all the other countries aren't in it. And I salute the initiative for what it's trying to achieve, but it's not inclusive. And additionally, for every initiative that we do, it takes operational power. For the things that we talk about, for every conference that they have, for every meeting of the leaders, it takes logistical power of the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, Secretariat of European Affairs, and other institutions. But I'm going to go back, and I've been saying this pretty much at every public appearance, of the Western Balkan Summit at Brdo pri Kranj. I'm not sure if you've managed to follow that, but at that summit there was something amazing that happened, which is the European Investment Plan. What it is 30 billion euros pledged to the assistance of the Western Balkans. I'm going to repeat that. 30 billion from the European Union for the Western Balkans. So we have 30 billion here that they've said, here it is, and they were very, very meticulous. And again, I apologize for referring to notes, but I just want to sort of point out some of the benefits that we can reap from this investment plan. So we have the Peace Highway linking Pristina and Niš. That's amazing. An infrastructural development which I think can really help connect people first and foremost, and then countries. We have the Corridor X highway, which is expected to be modernized and link Serbia and Croatia. We have the long-awaited railway between Skopje and Sofia. That's the first flagship. In the second flagship of connecting north to south, we have the Central European capitals connection through Sarajevo all the way to Ploče, the big port in Croatia. We have the renewable energy pillar, right, which is supposed to help us relieve ourselves of the fossil fuels and so on and so forth. And they talk about all these things which are, connecting Sarajevo to Podgorica and improving the connections between Sarajevo and Albania and so on and so forth. So my question is, if these are the priorities and they involve all these capitals which are not in the Open Balkans, and those are the European priorities, then whose priorities is Open Balkans addressing? And that is a question we need to ask ourselves. And ultimately, I think every time we have a regional cooperation initiative, on one hand, we have the Western Balkan Summit, which is an EU-supported initiative, and the Berlin process, which has given birth to initiatives such as RICO, which, irrespective of the hurdles it faces, it does try to connect people. So my question would be, and to make a film reference, and I think this will divide the room into millennials and Gen Z, how many of you have seen Jerry Maguire? There we go. The millennials have seen Jerry Maguire.
3 of them.
There is an iconic scene there where Rod Tidwell, an amazing character, says to Jerry Maguire, his sports agent, about any conversation, show me the money. That is the quote that we should always ask about any regional cooperation initiative in order to avoid, as I said, we don't have the luxury of prioritizing. We have to do a lot of things. We have to focus on infrastructure, renewable energy, youth connection, bilateral issues. Every time something comes up, show me the money. And that's where I'll end, and I'll hope that we can actually discuss a little bit more so that I don't speak at you anymore. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we clearly saw the difference between Gen Z and millennials here. And sorry? Yeah. But I also wanted to mention that all the topics you mentioned and that I really liked about the death of Pax Americana, the rise of China and everything, I think even though usually the youth in the Balkan region is the one that is more progressive, that is more leftist oriented, I still feel like they have a lot of fear about all of these changes because we live in a fast-paced, changing world, and even though they are the generation that is kind of getting used to it, it is very scary for all of the changes happening. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what the world will be when we get to the stage of policy making and changing the world. So it is very scary. And with that note, I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Christian Fidanovsky. And once again, please, if we can also talk about the idea of where do you see the leap coming to?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. As Emir mentioned before, it's not easy to be speaking at the graveyard panel. I know you must be exhausted from a very sort of multi-layered and very informative conference. I'm sure you've learned a lot over the past couple of days, but I'll try to be brief since it's the graveyard panel. But also in line with the nature of the panel, I'll also be a little perhaps pessimistic, at least in the beginning of my presentation, but hopefully we'll together find a more optimistic angle to end on towards the end. It's not I mean, we have to be honest, and this has come up a lot in the previous presentations as well, this is not a great time to be a pro-EU activist or someone who believes in the EU values in the Western Balkans. Some would argue that it hasn't been a good time to be an EU activist for a long time now, but in recent years we have seen a very big decline in support for EU membership across the region, especially unfortunately in my own country, in North Macedonia. Simonida mentioned the frustration with the whole EU process in the region, the so-called enlargement fatigue, right? People are getting tired. But it is also important to remember that there is no meaningful alternative for this region than EU integration. So I think that the very fact that we're here today and we're talking about the European prospect, if you like, means that there is some optimism in that pessimism. So we're not giving up yet, and it is even more important for you as the future, right, to share that, refusal to give up, no matter how dire the circumstances are. So I will mainly focus on North Macedonia, but I will also try to make some regional references. So as I said earlier, support for EU membership has been declining in the region. In Serbia, for example, a couple of months ago, we saw that for the first time ever, I think, the number of people who are against EU membership is higher than the number of people who are in favor, and that is a very sort of depressing statistic. It's not that bad in the rest of the region, fortunately. Young people, it depends on the country, but at least in North Macedonia, young people are normally more in favor of EU membership. So that's probably, encouraging. But even for them, support has been going down in recent years. And we see some other depressing statistics in North Macedonia, such as the fact that many young people, considerable numbers of young people, are ready to support leaders with with a strong hand. So they're ready to support more authoritarian ways of governing, and it's probably all related to this frustration with the EU process, because that then leads to a frustration with progressive values as a concept, right? So that's definitely not great. I think it's important also to divide young people, and we've been doing many divisions here today, but this is not going to be a Gen Z versus millennials division, but I'll try to come up with my own terminology. So old, young, and young, if you like, within this bracket of 18 to, let's say, 30. So for Emir and me, for example, we're definitely in the old-young category. The EU used to bring a lot of optimism because, for example, we remember as very young children, of course, but we still remember the time when we still needed visas to even travel to the EU, to visit any EU country. And then the EU decided to allow us visa-free travel, so we were very grateful for that. Then in North Macedonia, we had a very big political crisis a couple of years ago. So in 2015 and 16, there was basically a state capture in North Macedonia, a very big wiretapping scandal where the government at the time was spying on itself really, and major institutional figures in the country, and journalists, et cetera, et cetera. And the EU helped us overcome that. The EU sent representatives here to Skopje. The EU made it a very strong condition for us to overcome that challenge if we want to continue with the EU accession process. And I think that if it hadn't been for the EU, we probably wouldn't have been able to deal with our state capture. So for our generation, for the old young, we were, probably in our early 20s at the time, we were very grateful to the EU for that. And something that's very interesting, the EU for candidate member countries, the EU publishes these so-called progress reports. So they're actually very technical, not very exciting, but what's interesting is that these incredibly boring documents attracted so much attention in North Macedonia a couple of years ago, and probably even in the rest of the region. So when the EU says something, people listen. At least that was the case until a couple of years ago, but I hope that at least partially it continues to be the case. And with the young, it might be different, and that's what I'm worried about, because the young people are taking the visa-free travel for granted because it's always been there. Then they don't have any meaningful memory because they were still very young of the EU's involvement in dealing with our political crisis back in 2015 and 16. So what they think of when they think of the EU is the current situation, the current blockade in the EU accession process, the dispute that I'm sure you've talked about a lot over the last couple of days that North Macedonia has with Bulgaria, and the EU unfairly is viewed as well, perhaps not unfairly, but it is definitely viewed as an accomplice to Bulgaria and to the Bulgarian government and to the current situation. So it is not associated with anything nice, with anything hopeful, and we really need to change that, because I'm sure that since you're here at this conference, we all share these European values, and we all recognize that the EU, as imperfect as it is, it's really our only option for a meaningful interaction between our countries and those countries as a region with the rest of the world. So the reason I'm so worried about the future when it comes to the EU process is that support for EU membership is known to go down even more when countries start negotiating. So North Macedonia and Albania started negotiating at a very slow pace, of course, very recently. And as we know from the example of Croatia, as time went on, people got frustrated because this process is difficult. You need to change so many laws, you need to follow all these EU procedures, and people can get frustrated by that. So it's really important to continue with some optimism, because the road ahead is not going to be easy, especially for North Macedonia, which is in parallel with all the EU conditions, is also facing the issue with Bulgaria. So one thing that we can do is to continue to appeal to the EU, to Brussels, and to European countries to perhaps think about getting rid, or at least bypassing, the unanimity rule. It's something that's very important, the fact that in the EU a lot of things are decided unanimously by all the member countries, so everyone has to be in favor of something for something to happen. That doesn't sound very democratic to most people, because it sounds like, it allows for the possibility for one country, doesn't matter which one, to block a lot of processes. And it's not just about enlargement, it's also about foreign policy, relations with Russia. Very often there is one country that can sabotage all the EU's efforts on this topic. So this is something that the EU is aware of. This is not just about North Macedonia and Bulgaria, or just about the Western Balkans. So it's already on the agenda. The problem is that in order to get rid of unanimity, so this rule where everyone has to decide, you need everyone to agree that this rule should be changed, right? So that's a bit of an issue. But it's on the agenda, and if we continue to apply enough pressure on the EU and individual European countries, then maybe we can get there. And then we have to continue to work within our countries, because as I said, it's difficult to be an EU activist these days. But we have to continue to look at the bigger picture and all the benefits that our countries can derive from continued integration. So I believe we can do that. I think our generation, and I'm still not sure if I can speak in the singular, because yeah, there is the old young and the young young. But broadly speaking, our bracket, we have traveled more than any other generation before. We are super interconnected, and we understand the benefits of sticking together. And the EU is really the most logical form of doing so, especially for small countries such as, the Western Balkan 6. So yeah, I hope I didn't depress you too much with my presentation, and especially since it's the last panel. But it's important to know how tiring the road ahead will be, because we have to face that. And if we acknowledge that, then we might be more ready to deal with these challenges and not give up on the EU prospects. Thank you.
Thank you. We don't often talk about the problems within the EU inside when we are in the Western Balkans, and we don't actually, I don't think we understand that if you want to be a part of a group, it's not the day that we become part of it that we start worrying about it and thinking about it and talking about it. It's even the years and years before, because we can't expect from the people in the Western Balkans to actually, the day, I don't know, Montenegro, hopefully one day enters the European Union, that day everyone will know everything and that they will be able to be equal participants inside the EU. And yeah, we need to talk about it in the years ahead. So before we open the floor to the questions, does any one of you want to add something on top of the other participants and panelists, or should we start with the questions? Yeah, we can start with the questions. Does anyone have any to start with? Yeah. Technical difficulties.
Hi, I'm Amina, and today we've been listening to quite a lot of panels, and one thing that stuck with me is how Nikos from Greece mentioned that he kind of implied that I gathered that from that our countries are simply chess pieces in a bigger agenda and in a bigger game. And he even mentioned, for example, that it was on Greece's back that the EU didn't initially want to leave path to Turkey, and once they removed the veto for Turkey to enter the European Union, nothing happened. But beforehand, everyone was saying that it was Greece's fault for Turkey not being to enter into the EU. And considering that recently even I have been losing faith, and my friends and even my parents are losing faith, not with what's happening in Ukraine and what many consider that the sanctions haven't been enough and haven't been quick enough, the faith in EU is dwindling. And no matter what we're doing, whether it be social media or projects or funding, don't seem to be working. So I'm just generally interested to know your opinion on whether the EU's image can ever be in our countries, in our communities, if it can ever be mended, and will the people's opinion eventually become better if we are granted access into the EU? In Kosovo, we have the visa issues, so we still do not have the freedom of movement as do other countries. And considering we fulfilled all of the check marks and there still hasn't been anything from the EU, it feels like it's kind of going to be impossible to fix the image the EU has created in our country. Thank you.
Simonida? Yeah.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question, and we should have probably touched a bit more on it. The EU's image is problematized from many aspects in the region, in each country for its own reasons, but also in general because everyone sees that the region is stagnating. Now, if we go back to how this image was actually built, how a good image was actually built of the EU, this goes back to some of the early interventions in the early 2000s, specifically in North Macedonia. It goes back to the meritocracy that it employed during the visa liberalization, which was mentioned by Christian, and the same lack of meritocracy that it applies now in the case of Kosovo and the visa liberalization. If we take a look at public opinion, and North Macedonia is the case that I know the most of, we have had instances when the trust in the union went down, let's say in 2011, dramatically during our political crisis. But then when the EU actually sent signals of getting its grip together and sticking to its principles, the public regained its trust in the union. We see a similar drop of trust now, although the numbers on the support for EU membership are different. So when we talk about the image, we need to understand that there's a couple of questions that people traditionally ask. One would be, if there's a referendum tomorrow, would you vote for membership? And generally, with the exception of Serbia, we're still okay, although Christian was fair enough to note that experience shows that the closer you get to membership, the more of the public actually realizes that there will be losses in the short term, and the support goes down. But in our region, this drop of support is very high for the phases in which we are in. And in any case, in the case of Kosovo, I think this has been the worst affected with the visa liberalization. So most of people would expect that actually there is a sound decision by the European Union to actually grant visa liberalization for a decision by the member states, because the Commission has been recommending this for a very long time. This might help, but it won't improve the image completely, because we had this situation with the delayed membership in NATO, for example, and it takes a long time for the public to actually regain its trust and to appreciate the decision that was made. Arguably, we also have to keep in mind, because we're talking a very specific example, the visa liberalization is likely one of the most tangible outcomes, and the one of that the public will feel the most. And that's why a lot of us actually in this day and age remember the visa liberalization discussions and how it had an impact on the overall support for EU membership and support for EU principles more broadly. To be fair, in the long term, I'm not sure that afterwards, in the technical phases or the methodology that, for example, Emir mentioned, I don't see any other decision that can have such a strong impact as the visa liberalization in effect, because we just had this conditional start of the accession negotiations, which was delayed by probably a decade. But I would say that for us, the impact of the visa liberalization was much greater, even given these horrible circumstances in which we actually achieved the accession negotiations. I think I'll end there. I have a couple of comments on what was said before, but I'll let to the others, and I assume we'll have another round to chip in.
Just building off of what Simonida pointed out in terms of the process, I also think there is something to be said about political discourse domestically about the EU. I mean, if you look at from the way we talk about the EU, we always talk about going into the EU, as if it's one of those things where, you know, once we get in there, our institutions will magically transform and everything will be okay. So like the expectations, I think, are incredibly high. And in day-to-day political discourse, it's been used. For example, in North Macedonia, during the referendum question for the name change, it was in there. And there was other instances which are like on the day-to-day politics where EU is used. And I think we need to think about how we talk about the EU domestically so as to not exhaust that term and completely make it lose its meaning. So every time we talk about reforms, we talk about, oh, EU imposed reforms and so on and so forth. This is EU, this is EU, this is EU. So I think there needs to be like a political culture shift where we start to do things because it's for the good of the citizens, and the EU is a means to an end as opposed to the end. And I think that is something that is a little bit lacking. And I think we're putting, the EU is a little bit in crisis because there's a little bit too much on its shoulders in terms of what is expected and what it can do. It's an incredibly complex system. But as I said, it has like a gravitational pull of values, and it really hinges upon the individual member states' conduct and contribution. So we need to think about how we talk about the EU and contextualize it in our own spaces, whether it's Kosovo or North Macedonia or Bosnia and Herzegovina and so on and so forth, and make sure that we're doing reforms that will ultimately be for the good of the citizens. Because if you look at every EU member that joined the EU, brain drain didn't stop when they got into the EU. It actually got a little bit worse in the first years. It reaches a plateau, but it gets worse. People leave more because it's easier. So if we don't prepare our states economically, in terms of public service and so on and so forth, that will continue to happen. So I think the best thing that we can do, whether as a civil society sector, as youth activists and so on and so forth, is try to lift that burden off. If we see that confidence is plummeting, I think our role is to sort of change the way we talk about the EU, what it brings to the table. So it is a catalyst, it is a facilitator, but it's not a silver bullet. I think that's a little bit of a cultural shift that needs to happen in terms of our generation and how other generations view the EU. So just in terms of sort of the political culture and discourse around it, I think also has a role to play.
Yeah, I would like to make a couple of points. First, just on that last point, I completely agree that the political discourse about the EU is very problematic in North Macedonia and in the region as a whole. I would like to add that it is also very problematic when it comes to the time frame that politicians put forward for EU membership. They usually don't talk about specific dates anymore because, you know, who knows when we might be able to join, but they do say things like, you know, it's only a matter of time, be patient, and that's good, but the way they frame it sometimes creates these very unrealistic expectations, and that's reflected in opinion polls. Many people expect to see their country in the EU within a couple of years, even well, not a majority of people, but significant minorities of people have these expectations. And for North Macedonia, it's not going to happen within a couple of years, or for any country in the region for that matter. And when that expectation is not fulfilled, people will get frustrated, and support for EU membership will decline, probably. So discourse is very important. Emir mentioned earlier in the panel that we always find at least one thing to sort of disagree on, and we've found it now. Well, it's kind of a slight disagreement, but still, while I do definitely agree that this cultural shift that Emir spoke about is very important, I don't see it happening anytime soon. So I think in the meantime, it might actually be productive for us, if we frame it properly, to have this mindset where we're doing this for ourselves, but also for the EU, in the sense that you have illiberal politicians very often in the region who wouldn't be doing the appropriate reforms if it wasn't for the EU. So the EU is a very helpful carrot, a very helpful stick as well, depending on the circumstances. So we can use that kind of mentality of constantly proving ourselves to the EU in a good way. We can turn it into something positive, hopefully. Because as I said earlier, many good things for North Macedonia's democracy wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the sort of promise of EU membership. And yeah, finally to Amina's questions, which I found very interesting. I have to mention very briefly again the sort of, so actually to add to the previous point too, there is this new methodology for EU accession. Personally, I'm not an expert on that process, but the very fact that it is possible to go back with the negotiations and to reopen some chapters if things change in the meantime, I think that's very important, because otherwise we get sort of trapped into this assumption that we keep doing so many things, we keep reforming our countries, and the EU is not delivering. Now that's true, I agree with you, in most situations, especially again, in my country, it's been true for a very long time, but it's not like our countries are, the epitome of democracy. So there is still a lot for us to do as well. And we should be happy that there is that part of the methodology, that there is this, it's not unconditional, right? So we have to keep proving ourselves and keep reforming our countries.
Thank you. We can go to the next question, Peter.
Yes. Okay. thank you all three for your inputs. It's really refreshing panel discussion, and I wish that this would have been the first panel discussion instead of Radmila Shegarinska. Yes, for example, I was very, what to say, I'm very happy that I now have the chance at the last one to say this. I was very angry actually how idealized the European Union can be made on a panel discussion like this. I stopped counting the word hope, that how many times she said it, and every time she said it, I had this metaphor in my head of, you know, the donkey, and you put a carrot in front of the donkey, just, yeah, target day 2030, just have hope. So it's, yeah, really, I'm really thankful for you to touch upon this critical discourse, and that we should not idealize the European Union as much. I have to say also that I'm from Germany, so I have a completely different perspective, and I'm inside a different discourse than here, even though I've been living in North Macedonia for 2 years, so I kind of get both sides. But I want to even enlarge this now and ask you about your opinion, what you think about this thought of going even further with the critical discourse about the European Union within the Western Balkans. Because I will say 3 examples. The European Union has very strong economical ties now with Azerbaijan, which is a murderous regime that last month invaded another democracy with Armenia. In the middle of Africa, the European Union is supporting in the Sahel zone murderous organizations that stop migrants from crossing the first half of Africa so that they won't come into the European Union. And another example I want to mention, because it was not mentioned enough in my opinion on this conference, in the Mediterranean Sea, still every day people are drowning, and the situation in refugee camps in the whole European Union are horrible and dehumanizing. And those are shadow sites from the European Union and double standards that are not, what's the word, that don't go along with these so-called European values. To me, it's a very empty phrase. I really don't see the purpose of this phrase being repeated all the time, because they are breaking their own values on an everyday basis. And I think this is something also the Western Balkan countries have to be just aware of in the first place, even though the situation is completely different. And of course, first you worry about your own struggles that you have in the region before you worry about the Sahel zone or Azerbaijan and Armenia and Karabakh, whatever. But it's just something that, I don't know, I think every discourse about the European Union should be inherently inside this discourse. So what's your opinion on this? Should especially young people take this more into consideration when they talk about the European Union now? Or is it too much, too pessimistic? Or, yeah, what's your thoughts? Thank you.
Thanks, Marco. Thank you for the comment and the question, if I got it with Peter. That's a very good point. And one of the things I wanted to, when I was thinking this morning about what would be the best to share, one of the things that I should have mentioned is actually the building the capacity to criticize the project, building the intellectual capacity among the youth and among society to be aware of the pitfalls of the European project itself, which does not mean that the goal is not worthy in itself. But we have to understand that it's not an ideal project. And thank you for that, because the European Union was never meant, in my view, to be a democratizing tool. If we take a look, historically, it integrated, it developed some of its own standards internally, but democracy building was a domestic topic. It did have a transformational effect, going to what Emir said, in our very recent past, with some of the countries that exceeded 2004, 2007, and 2013. But the democratic transformation and all the building of the capacity to actually engage with whatever those European values are has to be a domestic task. Now, In our case of the Western Balkans, for some of the Euro enthusiasts that you met, and probably I'm completely certain that Radmila is among one of them. What we are hoping is that the EU, we will manage to have a process, to use the EU accession process in a way that some of the good examples of the previous enlargement countries did. We don't have any, probably we don't have, at least for our generation in our lifetime, we don't have another option for a country that's geographically linked to Europe, that's economically very integrated in Europe, but also as is the entire region. This does not mean that we have to, or that we are obliged to portray the project itself in the most purple or in the most pink light that you can ever imagine. Because the broader European Union project, at least in my view, has not dealt with a lot of the deficiencies, which are the ones that you mentioned. But for us, most strikingly are some of the huge violations of the rule of law and human rights in many of the EU countries, which makes it very difficult for me and for many of us at the national level to be using this term, just as you say, European values. Last, as you said, this region has a lot of its own problems and grievances, but it does tend to view itself as a recipient of international politics, as if some of the norms and those European values are built elsewhere, and we are just receiving them. If I had to, probably going back to Marco, liked the point of leaping into the future, if I could leap and see what I would like to see changed as a result of many of these interactions, is that most of the countries in the region also realize that they build those same values, that they are the creators of those same values. And we've had those opportunities as countries. For example, North Macedonia next year will be chairing with the OSCE. And this is a very risky year in which such a small country would be in the chairmanship of the OSCE. Albania has done even bigger efforts in terms of previously chairing the OSCE. So these are chances for us as countries and societies to reflect on these very difficult topics that you mentioned and to discuss the flaws of the project itself, but not that much, also linked to the different positions of many of the European Union countries. I think that for a country to have, probably to avoid some of the flaws of over-idealizing the EU and then experiencing the huge brain drain that many of them did after membership, this would be one of the critical aspects to achieve. But this comes with good education, it comes with independent media, and a lot of these preconditions are unfortunately missing in our context.
Can we go to the other questions if you don't have anything to add?
I would like to address the question about the phrase, right, European values, and how often it is being used. I completely agree. I can't even think of a phrase that's more overused than the phrase European values. But that doesn't mean that the phrase has become meaningless, at least not to me personally. I mean, when I think of European values, I guess I think of democracy, freedom, and prosperity. Other things as well, maybe, but mainly those three aspects. And I don't know any other word that can capture all three with one word. And of course, actions on the ground sometimes undermine those values and make it seem hypocritical when governments use that phrase. But I think we can protect the phrase from that. I think the phrase is still alive. I think the values are still there for us to discover. And I think Simonida used a very good word to describe this. It's a project, right? The EU is a project. It's not something that's a fixed category. It's what we make of it, and we have the power. Well, unfortunately, not Western Balkan countries, which are still outside of it, but people have the power within the EU to change the EU and to make it more consistent to its own values.
Another thing is that I completely agree with you in terms of the EU is far from perfect, and I think it's a cliche, but it is. And when I say far from perfect, it's deviated from its course. It's just lost a member, Brexit. We can say that it's misinformation, manipulation, so on and so forth, but it lost a key member, right? But the fact that you can come and say this and so is wrong with the EU, and you have that information at hand, says a lot about the society we live in, or you live in, you know, which is not necessarily the case with the alternatives when it comes to geo-strategic orientations in the world. your media is not censored to use the word war, as it is in some places, you know, or whatever special operation they're using or so on. Your country doesn't have Winnie the Pooh forbidden in it because somebody made a joke about the president in that context. So it's very, you know, we take a lot for granted. We talked a lot on the first day in terms of how the Czech Republic is taking things for granted, but we need to remember that, and first and foremost, values and principles are aspirational. They're never set in stone. They're not adhered to by everyone at the same time. But it's something we're gravitating towards, right? And of course, we're gonna have oscillations. There's never a straight line. If you, even in economics or anywhere, like there's never a straight line. There's always like slumps and ups and ups. But it's important to keep the trend up. And I think in terms of Europe as a continent and the European Union as a project, as we're talking about, I think the trend is going upwards. Even though we have some disappointment, so on and so forth, now is the time to rethink how we all fit into that narrative. The members within, you know, the big stabilizing factors such as Germany, such as France, and so on and so forth. And the newer countries who are still struggling with certain, I think, child diseases of the past, like Hungary, Poland, and so forth. It's a natural process. I think it's daunting, but it's necessary. It's daunting, but it's necessary. And again, this is important to talk about in the context of a youth conference because we all have a role to play and we're all here because we're interested in the process. Disappointment, again, is not a luxury we have. In the context of the climate change issues that we have, the shift in polarity, if we lose faith in our own principles and values, there are some people out there who are that speak with very firm conviction about theirs. So realistically, we do have challenges. We failed in certain places, and I don't think we need to be ashamed of saying that we failed in terms of European integration. That's fine. But how do we fix it? And what is the level of commitment we have to fix it as societies, as institutions, as organizations, and so on and so forth?
Any questions? Yeah. Amina?
Thank you. My name is Amina, and my question would be directed towards Mr. Christian. You shed light on one of the issues that we have within the EU, which is the principle of unanimity. So my question would be, what is your solution for that? Do we have an alternative? Would perhaps going in a majoritarian way be the proper way to go, or implementing a new system of voting values where we have one country's vote be valued more than one vote, or something more creative than this? Thank you.
Amina, for that excellent question. I'm not sure if I'm the best person on this panel to answer this question, especially in Simonida's presence, but I will try. I mean, my problem with unanimity, as I said earlier, is that it really goes against democracy. If democracy is about the voice of the majority, and unanimity can have one member sabotage decisions, then it's really the tyranny of the minority. It's the worst possible system if you think about it. And as I said earlier, the biggest problem is that in order to change this, you need unanimity itself. But it's on the agenda. And if we continue to put pressure, because again, many West European member states in the EU are not happy with how Cyprus, for example, has vetoed some decisions related to Russia in the past. It is very difficult to sanction Hungary and Poland in terms of their rule of law violations if those countries can simply, block those decisions. So this is not just a problem for North Macedonia or even for enlargement as a whole, but enlargement is probably the one issue where it is felt particularly strongly, because, as I said, I mean, I don't want to give nationalist politicians any further ideas, but Croatian politicians might decide one day to profit from blocking Serbia. If Serbia joins the EU before Bosnia and Herzegovina or Kosovo, we might have a similar situation. So I don't have a great answer, unfortunately, but I do think it's a very big problem.
But does Simonida might as well want to answer this?
Thank you. Now, for someone who studied European studies, for me, this is like the one of the things that we studied from probably the first day at university. The question of unanimity has always been there. I mean, the big question mark appeared when the big enlargement happened. So this is a remnant of the past. The problems that we are now seeing were largely a result of the fact that the countries did not decide in 2004 and prior to 2004 to actually amend some of the decision-making processes. The unanimity or the consensus building is a core in the EU. So that's it's also a question of how would any change in the decision-making processes impact the overall strive to make concessions. Because I mean, at the end of the day, you don't get to the point at the EU decision-making table to put the veto. These issues are sorted beforehand. So besides the discussion on introducing qualified majority voting, there's also the question mark of how would this impact actually the culture between the countries themselves. Rather than building a consensus, then a movement can be seen towards outvoting or to just collecting the numbers that are needed. In any case, at the moment, there is the big project within, which we should have mentioned probably as to the future, the Conference on the Future of Europe as a project which is built on many citizens' discussions, many experts' discussions, and was also very much discussed in the European Parliament with the readiness of some of the key EU member states, from what we know, such as Germany and France, to reopen the treaties and possibly to discuss these issues. Such calls for qualified majority voting and for possibly abolishing the veto in some phases have also come from Germany, and this was not the case before. So I think that probably if we had to talk about these leaps, then we are more likely to see such changes or discussion on such changes than we were probably in my lifetime or in the last 20 years that have just passed. I mean, there's a lot of reflection at the moment, and the granting of a candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova possibly might speed up these discussions down the road. When I say speed up, I would not expect anything in the next couple of years, but maybe in some medium term, to have actually a reflection on the harmfulness or the potential removal of the unanimity principles. But foreign policy, in my opinion, would be one of the last ones to go.
We have time for one more question, if, yeah.
Of course.
If you have also a question, we can do two at the same time. Yeah?
Hi, I just want to say that this last discussion was one of the most interesting to me personally. I really enjoyed all of your remarks. And I kind of want to ask you a question from everything that has been talked on this conference, specifically regarding the Ukraine war and how the Russian influence is very powerful in our countries, unfortunately, and we cannot pretend to be blindfolded, because even in Greece, North Macedonia, Serbia, and in other countries, I believe that most of the people maybe not necessarily support Russia, but they can find arguments to defend Russia. And since we had the momentum the EU momentum a few years ago, now we have kind of lost the track. I wanted to ask you, how can we go back on track in terms of regaining the momentum we had in terms of EU values and the preparedness for the people to indulge into the EU waters? Most people argue that the EU has not been generous enough in when they're attacking Russia for the war and all the blood that has been, mostly because, let's say, Israel. Last week there was a cancelled football match between Israel and Russia, and Israel was awarded 3 points. and they're saying how some of the EU countries have their embassies, and their biggest partner have their embassies in Jerusalem, and now they're saying that this is an attack on democracy. I'm saying this mostly because people are kind of losing the trust in the EU because of these precedents that has been done in the past few years. So how do we get back on track, and how do we get rid of the Russian influence in the Western Balkans?
That's I think one of the most important questions right now. But the analogy that I like to make, because I do work in the security, disinformation, PCD space, it's much easier, it's very difficult to build a tower of cards. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes effort, and so on and so forth. But you destroy a tower of cards with just one flick. So disinformation is destructive because it takes advantage of vulnerabilities in society. The way that the defense system architecture is structured right now is to defend a community, a society from external attacks that have a face, a name, a flag, so on and so forth. Now that's not the case. Now our societies are being attacked from within through information or misinformation and disinformation. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And in discourse, it's always important, especially when talking to older people who have encountered in large numbers who are sympathetic to the Russian cause, in terms of the alternative. Yes, the EU is like this and like that, but it's very important to know how much the European Union has invested in our countries. Especially, for example, if you can take any country. You can take Serbia. The biggest highway they have right now is an EU project. Right? You take North Macedonia. There are schools which haven't been touched by our country, but they have been built by the European Union. You have projects in Bosnia, whether they're social entrepreneurship or whatever you want to talk about, that give people employment that are added value to those societies. So I think my approach to this information is not always reactive. I think we do fail at celebrating the successes. There have been numerous failures, but I do think that we sometimes, because of this disillusionment, lose sight of the progress that we've made. Because there has been progress, although not immense, there has been progress, and there are successes that have been done through these initiatives. And that's why I mentioned the new European investment plan. 30 billion for the region. Guys, that's huge. We can't lose sight of that, and we need to talk about it more. But what I'm disappointed at is that I don't see a summit that my country is organizing or the region is organizing. Hey, how are we going to work together to spend that money? Instead, we're talking about things which we have no idea how we will operationalize. So that is how you combat it. I'm going to go all Don Draper on you, and again, film reference / show reference. If you don't like what's being talked about, change the conversation. Marketing 101. So we need to find ways in which we will portray the model of European integration as successful. And that is by smart usage of funds, by investing, and when we do invest, we present it as a European investment, and it's been facilitated, helped, or whatever phrase or terminology we want to use. If we want to keep, as Christian said, the European Union as a motor for positive change in our societies. So there's no magic formula, obviously, but that is sort of the approach we need to take. We need to find a way to not only be critical, especially because that is sort of the impulse, to find ways in which to promote the constructive narratives and the opportunities that we have, as opposed to only the challenges and the failures. And that is one of the things that I would have loved to hear over the last 3 days, but I didn't, whether it's a decision maker, whether it's EU experts or people who are working in different fields. We need to talk about the opportunities and celebrate the small successes we've made over the years. And I think that's the best way to counter any kind of narratives that are being pushed. That's my answer. I hope that is at least a little bit satisfying.
Thank you. We can now, if you want to add something, or should we go to the closing statements? Okay, yeah, we're going to the closing statements, and we're going to start with Ms. Simonida, and we heard a bunch of questions now, so you kind of felt what are the ideas and problems of the youth here actually feels deeply, so you can like, I don't know, bunch it all up and, yeah, close the remarks.
Sure, I'll try to do that in 3 minutes if that's okay. Starting with the last question, how can we make this more valid? I think that I completely agree with Emir that we have to celebrate the successes, and that the EU is not a silver bullet. But the EU did have a method in which it helped this type of countries transform. And this was through a lot of support over a decade or 15 years to help them transform themselves. And this is the way you actually successfully mobilize the public, the institutions, and so on. If this process goes on to drag for another 2 generations, then it will be very, very difficult to make it a success, going back to any of your questions, and it will be very difficult to make it more appealing, because it's not just politicians that look within their time in youth in power, but it's also people that look within their lifetime. So the process at least has to deliver within a given lifetime. And going back to I just wanted to comment, this is something that's left with me. I know that 30 billion sounds a lot, but we actually have 9 on the table and 20 which are yet to be mobilized. So as you said, pledged. Those we're not sure where they will come from. And with the 9 billion, the EU is already investing much less in this region than it ever invested in the candidate countries for 2004 and 2007. So as I hear, there's a lot of people among you that might be decision makers in the EU member states in the short term. So I would appeal there that the EU also needs to take the integration of this region very seriously and to view it as a part of itself, because I don't think that the region has any alternatives or any capacity to talk about real alternatives. Neither it should, because it's actually very much integrated already within the European Union as a result of celebrating those many successes that we've had. Now, this is historically the most integrated region with the European Union that has ever exceeded. That's the big success that we have to celebrate. So, I mean, so in the big picture, we just have to realize that we are very close together, and we just need to make this potentially work from both sides in the short and long term. And probably this is an appeal to the big EU member states. And if I had to leave it somewhere, then this would be France. So if there is a broad recognition in France, and I think here that goes to our colleagues from Kosovo as to their visa liberalization, I think that we can possibly make this work and make a good leap into the future.
So much for talking today with us. It was a pleasure, and yeah, big round of applause for you. Now we can go to Emir and your closing remarks. Yeah.
I think I'll just sound like a broken record, but I think for me it's ultimately just trying to be as constructive as we can in terms of the opportunities we have available when it comes to the EU integration process. I think, again, one, I guess, would be the perception of the EU as the end as opposed to the means to an end. Your strategic objective as a country should always be the well-being and prosperity of your people. And the EU should be the means to that end. And I will go back to that huge pledge, which I will continue to harp on about until somebody does something constructive about it and specific about it. Whether it's 9 billion, I don't think Open Balkans can offer 9 billion or any other initiative from any other place. The other I think are loans that we're talking about, to over 18 billion in loans. But still, that is a huge amount of money, a huge amount of potential, and that is what we need to do to reassert the credibility of the Union. Instead of talking about values and principles, let's talk about projects and concrete solutions to everyday problems. I think that is one of the ways in which you all can make a contribution in terms of putting that forth as the topic of discussion, in terms of requesting capacity building and how to leverage those. I would love to see one of your names on top of a project that is going to manage that funding distribution along with the state institutions. And ultimately, when it comes to sort of shaking your confidence, and all of us are a little bit unsure about what Europe means to anyone and what it will be in the future, I think it's important to think about, to contrast it with what the alternative is. Again, the generation that built the European Union is not around or is not socially active anymore, but we owe it to them in order to at least preserve what they have created in terms of stability. Because otherwise, the alternatives are not great. The alternatives are censorship, the alternatives are oligarchy, and the alternatives are extractive institutions which are only going to bring economic downfall to our own places where we grew up in. So, and again, I will go back to the fact that we are now that generation that needs to build and construct and take that load on our shoulders that we didn't ask for, but it's there. What the cost will be in terms of addressing it, we don't know, but there will be a cost. But that should not stop us from working towards the best possible solution and taking advantage of all the resources that we have to the best of our ability. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for the closing remarks, Christian, you have the floor.
Maybe you'll remember from my presentation earlier that I was very sort of desperately searching for an optimistic note, right? And I like to think that I finally found it. It will sort of try to build on the optimism expressed by Simonida and Emir as well. And I mean, I guess the best way to put it is to just acknowledge that we're still here in this room, at least based on all the questions that we've received, we're still hopeful about the European idea, because there haven't been questions at all about, you know, the open Balkans. We mentioned the open Balkans on the panel, but the audience wasn't interested in it. We didn't get a question on the Eurasian Economic Union. Nobody is thinking about joining that anytime soon. So clearly, Europe is still very much on our minds, and we're, I think, all committed to making it better. And one thing that just came to my mind is that this morning, when I was coming here from Skopje, my driver actually made a very interesting point. My driver at one point said, "Christian, are we ever going to Europeanize ourselves?" And this is something that we hear a lot as a phrase in this country. And we've mentioned before that it has some problems as a phrase, but it's a good phrase. Because, I mean, it brings optimism in this particular context, because Europe, in most people's minds, still means good. And that's our starting point. And then we can just build on that, I suppose.
I think anything I say now would be too much, so I'm just gonna say thank you to all of you once again, and I hope everyone here enjoyed the 20th conference and also this plenary session, which I personally found very inspiring, and yeah, something I'm definitely gonna listen back to on our Facebook page. So once again, thank you all and enjoy Krushevo.